Washington to talk about the self-sufficiency standard. We also have some colleagues, Shannon Brundle and Sabrina Sabrina's from the Office of Equity and Shannon's from ESD, to talk about the ways that we're using the self-sufficiency standard in our work. And so with that, I will pass it off to Annie to take from here. Thank you for being here. And I know there will be time, we hope there'll be time for some Q&A with Annie as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Director Matthews, and thanks for having me here to talk about the self-sufficiency standard today. I'm really excited to present this information to you all and also to hear from Shannon and Sabrina to kind of ground how the data is actually being utilized in practice. So again, my name is Annie Kucklick. I use she, her pronouns. I'm going to share my screen. Oh, if you don't mind allowing me to do that, and then I'll share my screen with you and I can share some visuals too. Not quite yet. There we go, I can share now. Thank you. So I am a researcher at the Self-Sufficiency Standard. Hopefully you all can see my screen now. We work out of the University of Washington School of Social Work, and I am co-author as well for the most recent overlooked and undercounted report that we produced for Washington State that we did in partnership with the Workforce Development Council of Seattle-King County. And we did this production last fall. We have some time plotted at the end of the presentation to answer questions. I'm going to be going through a lot of information. I'm hoping to make it very clear for you all, but I know that there will be some good questions and I'm excited to answer them and have more of a dialogue with people at the end of the conversation today. So before we begin talking about the standard and talking about the report findings, I just wanted to ground all of us in the mission of our work. The reason that we exist. And the reason that the standard exists and was designed is because we as a country are failing to accurately measure and understand poverty. And what does this mean? Beyond the narrative impacts, which are huge, right? What does it mean when we don't understand, we cannot measure poverty accurately in the United States? Our eligibility thresholds for critical benefits like SNAP or Medicaid are far too low. And many people who are actually really struggling to make ends meet are not eligible for those benefits. When we rely on the poverty counts that allocate resources both in our state and federally, or to measure economic security historically, we really miss large portions of our community who are not able to make ends meet. When we use a definition of poverty that was built on values from the 50s and 60s, we have progressed as a society significantly since then. And therefore our definition and the way that we are defining poverty also needs to adjust with the times. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute. And then we also, right now, we don't have a federal benchmark to ensure that the jobs that we are creating and supporting are jobs that are providing family sustaining wages. So the need for the standard really comes out of the fact that the official poverty measure is outdated, not keeping up with the cost of living. So government agencies, nonprofits, foundations, and policy tanks across the country have come together to partner with us to identify that they need a better understanding of what it takes to meet basic needs that includes geographic specificity and varies by different family compositions. So ultimately, our mission at the Self-Sufficiency Standard at the University of Washington is to pursue family economic security by leveraging the Self-Sufficiency Standard and socioeconomic data coming from the census to understand issues of affordability, of income adequacy, and of structural racism, which we see playing out in our data time and time again. So I'm going to be talking to you, I'm going to tell you more about why we need the standard, kind of how we define the standard, the methodology behind the calculation. I'll share some findings from our most recent report. And then I'll kind of describe how the standard is being used to define wage adequacy and look at a graph that visualizes the benefits cliff and what happens when someone starts earning a little bit more income, but potentially loses access to critical benefits like Medicaid and SNAP. And then I'll describe a little bit about how the standard is being used both in Washington and by other national partners. And then hopefully that'll be a good segue for Sabrina and Shannon later on. So before you're too distracted by the numbers on the screen, which I'll explain in just a minute, I want to give you a little bit more background on how the official poverty measure was designed. So it was originally calculated by a woman named Molly Roshansky, who was part of the Social Security Administration. And in the 1960s, she found a Department of Agriculture survey that said that families spent about 1/3 of their budget on food. So she took the economy food plan, which is now known as the thrifty food plan, right? Really meant for temporary use, not long-term nutritional sustainability. And she multiplied that number by 3 to define the very first poverty thresholds. And we have not changed that at all since that was initially designed in the 1960s. We've adjusted it every year for inflation, but the underlying method, multiplying the thrifty or economy food plan by 3, has not shifted. So there are obviously some significant limitations in the methods of this current poverty measure that we use, but I'm just going to kind of talk about 3 of them that the standard captures. So, the first being that this methodology hasn't changed for 6 decades, with the exception of updates for inflation. And this is a critical flaw. Food, we know, is no longer 1/3 of a family's budget. It typically sits around 11 to 12% of a family's budget. Second, the official poverty measure really fails to reflect the difference in the cost of living for families of different compositions. So the measure was written when it was much more common for one parent to stay at home caring for young children, or when childcare was relatively low cost. So it doesn't include the cost of childcare. And then third, the official, and this may be the most egregious component, the official poverty measure does not vary by geographic location. Alaska and Hawaii are the only exceptions to this rule, and it's a very minimal exception. We know that the variation in housing costs alone in the United States is in the most expensive areas of the country. It's nearly 4 times as much as the least expensive areas. And then, finally, just to kind of wrap up this, the poverty measure is just too low. In 2024, a family of 3 is considered in poverty if they earn less than $25,820 a year, or about $2,151 per month, which we know is less than the median cost of rent for a 2-bedroom rental in Seattle. So this is a big underestimation if you are a family of 3 with 2 young children having to afford the cost of childcare, particularly in a high-cost place like Seattle. And on the screen here, I document in 2024, today, we measure that you need almost $140,000 or $136,522 per year if you live in Seattle and you have a family and you're a single adult caring for an infant and a preschooler and you need to cover the cost of childcare. So that is a gross underestimation of what you need at a basic needs level in Seattle. So if this poverty measure is failing us as a statistical yardstick, how does the standard address the inadequacies and give us a better picture of real costs and struggle? The standard was originally developed by our founder, Dr. Diana Pierce, and she developed it as a performance measure to understand what kind of jobs and wages were needed to provide the basic needs costs for a family. In 1996, she created this measure, and it was meant to be a realistic and detailed understanding of what clients needed to be financially sufficient. She was finding that she was working on a training program for women, and the women were graduating from this training program, and they were finding that while they were making wages that were above the official poverty measure, the wages were not capturing their family needs. So she created this measure, In the early 2000s, Dr. Pierce moved to the University of Washington, and the Ford Foundation gave us a large amount of funding to expand the standard. And since then, we now calculate the self-sufficiency standard in 45 states, only 5 more to go. And we started receiving funding from IKEA in 2018, and IKEA, the furniture company, yes, to update the 27 states in which they have stores. So we now do regular updates for 27 states. So the self-sufficiency standard defines the amount of income necessary to meet basic needs. And our approach follows the most recent National Academy of Sciences recommendations, which call for taking a market basket approach to measuring the cost of each basic need for working families. So this means we take all major budget items, not just food. We take housing, healthcare, taxes and tax credits, miscellaneous costs such as broadband, basic cell phone access, clothing, diapers, etc. We assume that all adults are working full-time, so we include the all employment-related costs, such as transportation and childcare. We account for the geographic differences in costs, which is important for the cost of housing. And we vary the age groups of children. So we look at infants, preschoolers, school-aged children, and teenagers, which we know is particularly significant for the cost of childcare, which varies substantially by age, along with food as well. So overall, the standard defines a realistic measurement of the income requirements for over 700 different family types across each county, borough, or town in a given state. We have also had the opportunity in Washington to do smaller geographic analysis. So if you look through our data, and I'll share where you can do that later, you can find that we actually have calculations for within King County, within Pierce County, within Snohomish County, Benton County, and Kitsap County. So it is necessary to acknowledge that the standard is really meant to be a minimally adequate measure. Our goal is to calculate the income that would be needed to meet just the basic needs without public benefits, such as SNAP or child care assistance or Medicaid. However, that's not to say that income supports and public benefits do not provide essential, sometimes life-saving support. We calculate the standard without assistance so that we can really understand the positive impact that these income supports can have on meeting wage adequacy when earnings are not sufficient. And I'll talk about that when I share the wage adequacy graph later on. So we calculate the standard. We don't add presents or vacations or any extracurricular sports for children. We only assume groceries prepared at home. We don't include any costs of eating out. We don't have any informal assistance baked in by, babysitting from a family member. So it's really, again, meant to be a basic needs measure of what it takes to make ends meet. But even considering that minimal adequacy, costs for families in Washington state are significant, particularly for families with young children. So on this slide, I have the monthly costs for 4 different family types living in Thurston County. Each bar represents a different cost. So we have a single adult who needs $3,420 per month in order to meet their basic needs. We have a household of 1 adult, 1 preschooler who needs $6,015 per month to meet basic needs. We have 1 adult, 1 infant, and 1 preschooler who has the highest monthly budget, needing about $8,200 a month. And then we have 2 adults with 1 school-age child and 1 teenager, kind of as the family ages, and they need $6,659 per month. Note that the family that has an infant and preschooler has the highest expense because they are paying about $2,846 per month for the cost of childcare. Between that and the cost of housing, which is represented in the bottom purple bar, that takes up about 50%, maybe a little bit more, of that family's budget. We know across the country that families who are taking care of young children, housing and child care typically take up about 50% of that household's budget. So because we've been in partnership with the Workforce Development Council of Seattle-King County, we have data that ranges all the way back to 2001. So we can document historical trends over time. This graph visualizes how annual costs have changed for a family of 2 adults, 1 preschooler, and 1 school-aged child living in Clallam, Clark, and San Juan County, ranging from 2001 to 2023. You'll notice that the costs have greatly jumped since 2020, and that's mostly due to housing and childcare costs increasing at a rapid rate. So, over the last 23 years, we've seen costs, basic needs costs for San Juan County increasing at a rate of 129%. If we were to map out the federal poverty guidelines and how they have increased over time, we would only document a 77% increase. Likewise, if we were to add median earnings onto this graph as well, we would only see about a 90 or so percentage increase over time. And what that means is that median earnings are not keeping pace with costs over time. So families are having a harder and harder time making ends meet at a basic needs level. Okay, so now that I've kind of introduced everyone to the shortcomings of the poverty measure and discussed, the basic methodology of the self-sufficiency standard, I now want to pivot over to discuss the methods and findings from our most recent report that we produced last year. And this report does something a little bit different. I've talked about the threshold, I've talked about the standard. This report now uses census data to understand and capture the count of households in Washington state whose earnings are not keeping up with costs as defined by the self-sufficiency standard. We document that in Washington state, 28% of working age households are not able to meet their basic needs, more than 1/4. That contrasts with 10% assumed by the official poverty measure. That means that over 64% of the households who are likely struggling to make ends meet, right, as defined by the standard, they're not being counted in the official poverty measure counts of poverty. So that is a 64% underestimation of struggle in Washington state. So how did we calculate these numbers? To estimate the number of households who are at risk of not meeting their basic needs, we used the 2021 American Community Survey 1-year public use microdata sample. And it was the most recent survey of this type available at the time that we were producing the report. They've since released the 2022 update, and we hope to do some additional analysis with that data soon over the next year. But because the standard estimates the cost of living at a basic needs level for working families, we do make several changes to the sample. So we remove household members who are not expected to work, so seniors over the age of 64, as well as adults who are identified as having a work-limiting disability. We also remove any income that they have from the household total income. And then we also exclude group quarters, as we're assuming that all people within a household are sharing resources. So once this new sample is defined, earnings from each household member in that 2021 American Community Survey are summed, and that determines this new household income. And then that total household income from the American Community Survey is then compared to the appropriate annual self-sufficiency standard based on that household's location by PUMA, the public use microdata area that the census uses, as well as the number of adults and the number and ages of children. This allows us to create a relatively simple assignment of whether that household has inadequate or adequate income. There are some limitations to this approach. I'm sure all of you potentially already identified this when I was talking about our sample. But some of these stem from the American Community Survey dataset itself, and then some stem from the threshold, the standard that we use. So the American Community Survey dataset limits its responses for American Indian to a list that does not encompass the many diverse tribes in the United States. The data that is included in the report aggregates the tribes across the state into one category titled American Indian, but we recognize that there is a lot of nuance and difference across Washington state tribes that may not be captured by this aggregation in the report. Wherever it's possible, we also try to disaggregate Asian households and Native Hawaiian households, but previous versions of this data has not done this. And so for the sake of historical comparison, there are times where we use that combined category. And then the ACS also limits its respondents to indicate if they are either male or female, and therefore exclude people who do not identify as either. We recognize that this limits our analysis to a binary framework that does not accurately reflect everyone's reality. On the standard side of this analysis, because the costs that we calculate are meant to reflect full-time work, we exclude anyone in the household that's not expected to work. As I mentioned, this includes folks who have a work-limiting disability or anyone over the age of 64. We do acknowledge that these groups often have unique and varying cost needs that are not reflected in the standard, and we hope that there will be more data in the future. We're advocating for more data in the future that reflect and capture the needs of these individuals, because based on other research, we've identified that these groups often have higher levels of poverty and therefore need to be included in the sample to understand their unique needs. So now that I've shared some limitations and kind of the way that we've calculated this data, I'm going to go into sharing some of the findings. So the bar graph on this slide shows each historical calculation in Washington state and how the percentage of households below the standard and below the poverty line has changed since 2000. So you'll notice the blue portion of the figure represents the percentage of households below poverty. So in 2021, there were 10% of households in Washington state below the poverty line. The gray portion of the slide indicates those households who are above the poverty line, but below the self-sufficiency standard. So still struggling to meet their basic needs. And then, aggregating those two, you'll note that in 2021, as I mentioned, 28% of households are struggling to make ends meet. This compares most closely to the reality of households in Washington state at the end or during the Great Recession in 2013, where 11% of households were below the poverty line and 17% were above the poverty line, but below the standard, another 28%. In 2019, about 22% of households were below the standard, with 7% below the poverty line and 15% above poverty and below the standard. There are some dramatic differences, however, when we take into account and disaggregate by race and ethnicity. So continuing to share some of the historical findings, this table documents the percentage of households below the standard in total and by race and ethnicity. In general, we've seen income inadequacy rates have gone up steadily for all race ethnicity groupings since 2019. And we know that 2019 was the height of economic activity in Washington state when we had historically low rates of unemployment at 4%. And yet we still see income inadequacy rates for Latinx and Black households above 1/3 of those respective populations. So in 2019, 39% of Latinx households and 40% of Black households, 26% of other or multiracial households did not have sufficient income for meeting their basic needs. Those percentages have grown since then. So in 2021, we see 45% of Latinx households, 45% of Black households, and 30% of other or multiracial households are struggling to make ends meet. That's in comparison with 24% of white households and 24% of Asian and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander households. And again, I've aggregated the data here because that's how it was reported in the past, but I will disaggregate it for you on the next slide. So before I kind of talk about the percentages, which we also witnessed on the last table, I just want to mention, before this presentation this year, I often review the 10-year poverty reduction work group plan. And what I hope that this data does is that it provides sort of evidence to help tell the story of the root causes of poverty that are documented in the introduction of that poverty reduction work group plan. Including that while economic insecurity was exacerbated by the pandemic, we have historical documentation that this problem is long-running and extensive. This has been happening, this trend of lower earnings and higher costs has been happening since 2001, as we've been documenting in our historical data. It affects families throughout the state, but certain groups are disproportionately more likely to struggle to cover basic needs, and this points to root causes, not individual shortcomings. The systemic effects of structural racism and oppression that have been baked into policy have clearly not served Washingtonians equitably. So what we see on the slide here, systemic racism has resulted in more people of color struggling to make ends meet in Washington than white households. Latinx, Black, and American Indian households are particularly impacted, with 45% of Latinx and Black households, 44% of American Indian households, and 36% of Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders struggling to meet their basic needs, as documented by the self-sufficiency standard. White and Asian households have an income inadequacy rate of 24%. Note that the dashed line in this figure represents 28%, which is the total below the standard in Washington state, and that will be pretty consistent with the other graphs that I'm sharing with you. So because we know that the experience of the Asian category is not monolithic, when we further disaggregate the Asian group, we can see some distinct variation in the percentages who are struggling to cover costs. Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander households have the highest rate at 36% of households struggling to make ends meet, while Asian Indian households have the lowest rate at 13%. The dashed line in this case represents all Asian identifying households at 24%, including that Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander group. The range between this is 13 for Asian Indian to 21% for Taiwanese, 22% for Cambodian, likewise with Korean, 22%, 23% for Filipino households, 25% for Chinese, with the exception of Taiwanese, 27% for Japanese, 34% for Vietnamese, and 36%, as I mentioned, for Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander. So this really demonstrates, right, the variation that gets lost when you're aggregating these groups in the broad population that exists in Washington state. So again, wherever possible, when the sample size is above 1,000, we really try to ensure that we're disaggregating so that we can more accurately reflect the nuance of these populations. So we also document, when we're looking at this data, that Washingtonian householders who identify as non-citizens tend to have higher rates of income inadequacy, and those rates are compounded if the householder is a person of color, particularly if they are Latinx or Pacific Islander Native Hawaiian. For example, 63% of Latinx householders without citizenship are struggling to cover their basic needs. And you can see this disproportionality when the total population of Latinx households struggling to make ends meet is 45%, but non-citizens experience income inadequacy rates at 63%. For Black households, when 45% is struggling to make ends meet, 56% of naturalized households struggle, and 46% of non-citizen Black households are struggling to make ends meet. As I mentioned before, childcare costs are growing. They're significant for Washington state households. So for families who have young children, they have a higher threshold to meet because they have that cost of childcare to take on. So families with young children are much more likely to struggle to meet their basic needs and cover this high cost of childcare. This figure compares households with no children, married, male-led households, women-led households, compared to households with children present, married, single father and single mother households. It also disaggregates by people of color and white households. We have aggregated people of color in this particular example because, again, the sample size gets really small when we're comparing multi-tabular data sets like married and no children. So we did aggregate it in this case, and some patterns do appear. So, the main takeaways from this figure is that when we separate households by presence of children, those with children have considerably higher rates of income inadequacy than those without children. So married households who have children, 28% of them struggle to make ends meet. For single father households with children present, 46% struggle to make ends meet. For single mothers, 65% of households struggle to make ends meet. But when you look at that by households of color, you see that 75% of single mother households who identify as people of color are struggling to make ends meet. 3 in 4 mothers who identify as people of color are having a hard time covering their basic needs with their earnings alone. This compares to, single mother, no children in the household, female-led, 32% of women of color-led households without children struggle to make ends meet. 28% of white women-led households struggle to make ends meet. So on the whole, we know that increased educational attainment of the householder decreases income inadequacy, and the rate is not consistent across white households and households of color. So notice that on the axis here, this represents income inadequacy rates, and then the bottom axis has educational attainment, including no high school diploma or equivalent, some college, and then bachelor's degree. And overall, these lines trend down, right? So a little bit more educational attainment tends to lead to lower levels of income inadequacy. But these benefits are not shared equitably by women of color and white women and men of color. So the line at the top indicates, this orange line indicates women of color, the dashed orange line represents white women, solid blue line represents men of color, and the dashed blue line represents white men. So we see that while 49% of white men with no high school diploma are below the standard, almost the exact same percentage of women of color with some college have inadequate income, 48%. Likewise, women of color with a bachelor's degree or higher still have an income inadequacy rate that is more than 10 percentage points higher than white men with a bachelor's degree, 21% versus 12%. This figure shows the distribution of working age households in Washington state in the top bar. So this represents all households, all working age households in Washington state. And then the bottom bar underneath represents the distribution of households who have incomes below the standard. Note that 30% of households who have income below the standard have 2 or more working adults within their household. So even with a substantial amount of work hours, income does not always meet the cost of basic needs. Most households who are below the standard had at least one employed adult, 80%. And typically those working adults were working full-time and year-round. So again, what we are seeing here is that it's largely inadequate wages, not work hours, that are presenting this barrier to income adequacy. So to continue to understand the trends of work and the payoff of certain occupations in Washington state, this table has the top 10 most common occupations among householders below the standard. So the most householders in Washington state who have the most workers struggling to make ends meet are cashiers, with about 11,000 workers who are struggling to cover their costs. The second is janitors and building cleaners, other agricultural workers, cooks, personal care aides, retail salespeople, supervisors of retail sales workers, customer service representatives, nursing assistants, and teaching assistants. And note that we also collect data on the percentage that are both identifying as people and workers of color and the percentage who are identifying as women. And we see that there is a disproportionality in the percentage that identify as people of color and women. So in Washington state, about 33% of working age Washington households are identifying as workers of color. So anytime you're seeing a percentage here that is above 33%, that means there's a disproportionality. So the only occupations that do not have a disproportionate amount of people of color are supervisors, supervisors of retail sales workers and customer service representatives. The rest have a disproportionate amount, or about a proportionate. Teaching assistants have a proportionate amount of people of color. Same with women. Women constitute about 50% of the Washington workforce, and 77% of cashiers identify as women. 91% of personal care aides identify as women. So this starts to demonstrate the concept of occupational segregation that we do a lot of analysis on in our work, where we see certain demographic groups overrepresented in occupations that often have lower wages and are not providing sufficient earnings for people to cover their basic needs. So, I've talked about this. 28% of households in Washington state are not able to cover costs, but there is significant geographic variation across the state. Income inadequacy ranges from about 24% in King and Snohomish County to about 40% in Okanagan, Barry, Stevens, Yakima. All of those regions have a higher percentage of people who are struggling to meet their cost of basic needs. And recognizing that this still takes into account, their actual basic needs, which we calculate by county. So we're looking at housing, childcare, food costs that are specific to those locations. We also, because the census collects household data by public use microdata area, which is a sampling of about 100,000 households, we can narrow this analysis even further. And while this isn't demonstrated on this graph, it's important to acknowledge that when we're looking at these smaller geographic regions called PUMAs, we can see that the range of wage inadequacy widens even further. So only 12% of households are struggling to make ends meet in the Sammamish, Issaquah, Mercer Island, and Newcastle region, compared to over 40, about 41% in Yakima and the Sunnyside and Grandview City region. We also can dive into that data even further and analyze that by race and ethnicity. When we look at the Seattle City West, so this incorporates the Duwamish and Beacon Hill area, 43% of people of color have earnings that are not keeping up with costs, compared to 13% of white households in that area. So that is a gap of 30% in the Beacon Hill Duwamish region, which is huge. And it's one of the most significant gaps that I've seen in most of the research that I've done across the United States. So it's just pointing to that severe inequality in the Seattle region. So in Washington state, a lot of our eligibility for income supports, like the Washington Basic Food Program, actually aligns with 200% of the federal poverty guidelines. So multiplying just the 100% poverty guideline that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation times 2. This therefore can be like another helpful indicator for understanding the state of struggling households. It's often used in a lot of states as sort of a secondary analysis of how households are doing in a particular region. So we took this on as a comparative point in the report to determine how many households are actually above that 200% of the federal poverty guidelines, but still under the standard, so still likely struggling to meet their basic needs. And we found that 225,000 households are making earnings that are above 200% of the federal poverty guidelines, but they're not sufficient to their household's composition in their household's location. So what does that mean, right? It means that about a quarter of 250,000 households are likely not eligible for any form of financial assistance in order to meet their basic needs, because we often tie so many of our benefit systems to that 200% threshold. And that's tricky, right? We need to figure out how to ensure that these households are also able to access financial assistance so that they can meet their needs. So I'm going to move on to another slide here. So that kind of pivots away from the report findings that we produced last fall. We talk a lot about the standard, about how can you narrow this gap, right? How can you meet the cost of basic needs? And there are two primary methods that we talk about. The first one is obviously raising incomes and increasing earnings. So, increasing the minimum wage is a way to do this. Expanding tax credits, ensuring, guaranteed income programs, ways to get more money in people's pockets so that they can narrow the gap between their earnings and what they need to meet basic needs. The other way that we can do this is actually by reducing costs for families. So if we reduce the cost of childcare, if we reduce the cost of food that they're facing, that is another way that they can meet at least basic needs wage adequacy as they are journeying to a potentially higher wage to meet their basic needs. So on this graph, I'm going to demonstrate this idea of wage adequacy by the self-sufficiency standard, and also this idea of the benefits cliff, and what happens when someone who's potentially earning more income loses access to some really critical public supports. And I will note that this figure is from an analysis that we did for Maryland. We weren't funded this year in Washington State to do this analysis on Washington State benefits, but it's in the hopes we will be able to do that in the future as well, so I can share specific Washington State programs with you here. But on the x-axis, you'll notice this hourly earnings that range from $13 an hour up to $43.25 per hour. And then on the y-axis, you have the percentage of wage adequacy. And then all of these different color groupings, which I'll explain more, represents a different package of income supports. So the bottom darkest kind of region represents this household with 2 young children, what they would need without any income assistance. So, with about an hourly earning of around $13.25 to $13.50, they're earning about 39% of what they need for this household type to meet their basic needs, right? And this grows all the way up, and they aren't reaching their full basic needs costs until about $43.25. This is a more expensive area of Maryland. They have a higher cost of childcare and a higher cost of housing to meet. So they need about $43 an hour in order to meet their basic needs. So going back to the $13.25, so say they were making $13.25 per hour, and they're trying to care for their children, there's about a 60% gap in their ability to meet all their basic needs. So how do they fill that? So if the family was able to access childcare assistance, their income adequacy would increase to about 57% of their basic needs. If they're also able to access some healthcare, so Medicaid and the Children's Health Insurance Program, their income adequacy increases to about 63-64%. If they're also able to access SNAP and WIC for their family, their income adequacy increases to almost 80%. And if they're able to access the housing vouchers, which decreases their cost of rent to 30% of their income, they can almost reach all of their basic needs, right? They're almost to that 100% wage adequacy. Now, it's important to note that not all families, very few families are actually able to access all of these different income supports. So this is a rare case that a family is able to access that. But if they were, we can really see the impact that makes, right? They're almost to 100% wage adequacy. Now, when I'm talking about the cliff, you'll notice that on the region that has the housing, childcare, food, and healthcare package of work supports, their income adequacy dips significantly after about $14.50 an hour. So if they start earning a little bit more, $1.25 an hour more, they lose access to Medicaid. So the adult is now responsible for paying for their own health insurance. And that means their costs go up and their overall ability to cover their basic needs drops by, almost like 6 or 7% here. The same thing happens when they lose their ability to access SNAP. When they're making about $18.75 an hour, they lose access to that critical work support. And so their income adequacy dips. And now it's back to about 90%. So there's a big gap between what they need to meet their basic needs. Going all the way over, so then they start increasing their wage and they hit about $34.50 an hour. They lose access to their children's health insurance program, or CHIP. And they're, while they were able to meet full wage adequacy with childcare and healthcare as benefit programs at around 28 and 25 cents per hour, as soon as they reach that $34.50 an hour, they lose that children's health insurance program and their wage adequacy drops pretty significantly. And then when they lose their childcare scholarship program for the children, so they no longer have any childcare support, there is a significant drop, maybe 25 percentage points wage adequacy, and they now no longer can cover their basic needs. So if that earner goes from making about $34.25 per hour and they're feeling good, right? They have children's health insurance and they have childcare support, but then they increase and they make about $35 to $36 an hour, they no longer have access to those supports and their wage adequacy drops significantly to the point where they can no longer cover their basic needs. So this just demonstrates this concept of wage adequacy, using the standard as a kind of benchmark of understanding what someone needs to meet basic needs, and also of, what happens when a family does get access to all of these really critical income supports. It significantly increases their financial security. But then we have to be careful when we're designing, when we're thinking about creating these subsidies, that they're not immediately kicked off when they earn 25 to 50 cents more per hour. So a pretty complicated graph, but hopefully people are sort of understanding the meaning behind that. And I'm happy to talk about more. And I can see some questions popping up in the Q&A. So hopefully we'll get to discuss this more. But that was kind of the last graph that I'll share with you today. You've been great about bearing with me on all of that. I'm just going to kind of quickly share, because I know my time is almost up, about how the standard is utilized both in Washington State and across the country. So in Washington State, our partner at the Workforce Development Council of Seattle-King County has come up with the calculator.org. Everyone can go to this website and visit it and input their monthly income and their expenses and determine, how much are they falling short? Could they be eligible for income supports like the health, CHIP, Medicaid, the Washington Food Program? And then, if they're potentially looking at a new job or they're looking at a pathway towards a new career, does that career provide family financially sustaining wages? So this is a really good tool. And the hope is that this is going to be developed even further so that it represents that cliff effect, so we can really see where that happens on someone's pathway to economic security. So I think that it will be developed over the next year or so to include that as well, which will be really exciting and really great to have. The one last thing that I'll mention for the self-sufficiency standard calculator is that our partner recognized that the housing costs that we were utilizing in the basic methodology of the standard, which use the Department of Housing and Urban Development's fair market rent data, which is typically reported at the 40th percentile, meaning that 40% of rent in that area is cheaper than that, and 60% is more expensive. they were recognizing that that 40th percentile data point was not accurately capturing kind of the high cost of rent that people were experiencing. And this was kind of in that 2021, 2022, when rent was really starting to jump after the pandemic. So we adapted that, and we instead used the 50th percentile data for rent costs in Washington State in this 2023 data set that you'll see produced in the calculator.org. So just noting that there might be a slightly higher wage represented based on kind of the wages that I've talked about in my presentation today in the calculator.org. But I really encourage you to go check that out, use it, and just recognize that it's going to be adapted and developed. And then finally, my last thing to share with you all is that, the standard has been utilized by many different organizations across the country, policymakers, foundations, nonprofits, government agencies. There's a lot of really, fancy words that I'll explain in a minute on the slide, including improving public policy for working families, creating more realistic eligibility guidelines, setting fair wages, developing programs and services for individuals and working families, advocating for expanded public assistance, documenting the cost of living, evaluating program outcomes, and tracking community economic well-being. But there, specifically how it's being used. So, for example, in Washington State, policymakers are actually using the standard to inform decisions regarding maximum grants for crucial programs like TANF and refugee assistance and supplemental security income. So the Washington State Standard of Need that you can access, that's actually based on calculations from the Self-Sufficiency Standard. Organizations like the Women's Foundation for the state of Arizona use the standard as a base salary. So they use, I think, one adult with a preschooler. That is their base salary for anyone in the organization who gets a job there. The standard can play a really critical role in advocating for the expansion of public assistance programs. For example, a partner in New York named FPWA uses the standard to demonstrate the need for policies such as the expansion of the state tax credit and increased eligibility for childcare assistance. In Marin County, this is a new example. A stipend is actually available for board and commission members whose household incomes fall below the self-sufficiency standard. And this initiative is really meant to ensure that individuals who might have less financial means still have the opportunity to participate in civic leadership and promoting a more representative and inclusive decision-making process for those organizations. So that is the end of my portion of this presentation. Thank you so much for listening to me. I really hope that this data, again, provides sort of an underlying foundation to really prop up and encourage shifting the narrative around these conversations at work about how we minimize this inequity between households of color and white households, and how we start creating solutions that build, ultimately long-term financial security for Washingtonians. So thank you so much. And my email is included here. It's akuckl@uw.edu if you want to reach out to me with any other questions, but I will pass it off.
Yes, thank you so much, Annie. Appreciate that. Let's show her some love with some emojis. Go ahead and use that react button or drop it in the chat if you would like to. While everyone is doing that, we have some questions that were in the chat, and I kind of compiled a list. And so I'm going to redrop those in the chat for you, Annie. And if you want to verbally answer a few of those and then maybe type out your responses to the others, that could work. And then for anyone else who has questions, please send an email to Annie, as we're kind of running on a really short time crunch. So Annie, if you want to drop your email in the chat as well for folks to copy and paste, we will do that. So in the meantime, let me drop this for you. Oops, that is the wrong button. Okay, here we go.
Sabrina, I can look at the Q&A. Is that where I should be looking and answering some questions?
There are some there and there's some in
Okay.
the chat. So I
Okay.
did both except for there was a few comments in the Q&A. So if you want to start with the questions in the Q&A and then I'll drop the other ones in the chat, that would work.
Okay, awesome. So Jeremy, I'm going to start with your question. So it said, you state, if you don't mind that I repeat it out loud for everyone. The question is, I often take issue with the HUD fair market rent estimations. When I use the calculator for West Pierce County and then went on to Redfin, there are no units or homes you can rent for $1,500. Self-sufficiency standards don't include success for growth, like saving for a home, saving for education. So in your work, have you identified contingency percentage rates for differently sized households? For example, a single person is the contingency rate 10% of the total, compared to a 3-person household is 30%. How can we go from sufficiency to thriving? Thank you. I think that is like a really good question, and I really appreciate the chance to talk about it. There are kind of several different questions that are baked into this one question, so I'll do my best to answer each layer. So with the HUD fair market rents, we do rely on that 40th or 50th percentile. We try to do some additional research. So most recently, I've been looking at housing costs in Pierce County and comparing that with Zillow listings and Redfin listings to determine whether those rates are actually like sufficient, if they can actually people can find housing at those rates. And I have seen that for the 2024 data, it does look like there are significant amounts of rentals available for the rates that we are producing. I'm curious if maybe you're looking at an old data set here, or I kind of would be happy to talk to you more about that, but we do try to do some analysis comparing with like real rent data. We use the fair market rents, and the problem with those can be that they are looking at the American Community Survey gross rent factors from previous years. They recently have changed that, where they're now including other listings from Redfin and Zillow, some private corporations, to include some accurate like 2-day costs. So I think that those will start changing. But it's a good question, and where we can, we'll use the 50th percentile if we don't feel like that's being accurately represented. And then for the contingency rate question, so when we're looking at households, we are looking at specific needs for each individual within that household. We're not doing any sort of like percentage increase based on person increase. So if we have a young person with a school-age child, we're looking at the cost of childcare before and after school. We're looking at what they need to eat, cost of transportation to and from daycare, from school. So we are looking at each individual cost. And then the biggest question, which I think is the most important, is how do we go from sufficiency to thriving? And that is a huge question. And the self-sufficiency standard really doesn't represent what we need to thrive. It represents what we need at the bare minimum. So we also need other measures. And there is an effort right now led by our partner in New York State to produce a true cost of living measure that actually captures what people need to meet long-term financial sustainability. So what I would hope is that, people will have these multi-measures. We have the federal poverty guidelines, which are clearly inadequate. And then we have the standard, which is kind of a secondary level of income adequacy. And then we'll have the true cost of living, of how we really get to long-term financial security. So thank you for that question. I realize I probably went a little over on answering that. Just a good one. The next question, maybe I'll have time for this one. Policy question: if it is determined that someone was paid more in benefits than the state determines they should have, we as the state are sending them notification of this with a sum of thousands of dollars in some. I would imagine a family already struggling financially, this would be overwhelming and create more struggles. It seems like if we were to notify them of the need for a remedy and to find a solution without the dollar amounts, then that can determine what supports are needed without potentially creating panic and never being able to get their head above water, in my opinion. I think that sounds like a really promising solution. And I think hopefully my demonstration of the benefits cliff kind of showed what happens when a family loses access to some of these income supports. So yeah, I think the more creative that we can get to ensure that families aren't being taxed or potentially losing these critical supports is great. Jeremy, also I'm actually going to go to another question and I can answer that in the chat. Anonymous participant, what was the cost to research the benefit cliff analysis? I'll also answer that in the chat too. I think that would be a good one. The last question, thank you for your research and establishing the standard. This really highlights the struggle I've been having in working in the federal supplemental nutrition programs, which use the FPG to determine eligibility. Someone focusing on advancing equity in the programs, I'd love to seek partnerships in applying the standard, advocate for change at the federal level. Awesome. I love to hear that. That's great. Sabrina, any other questions that I can answer right now, or should we carry on?
Yeah, we actually have one more. So
Okay.
Isaksiche, if you would like to unmute and go ahead and ask your question.
Awesome. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. Well, it's good to see you, Annie. My name is Isaksiche. It's a spell where I can see ASL. You're doing good work over there. But I'm a citizen of the Abzalogad Nation as a uni race, King County, head of household. It's very disturbing to see the statistical insignificance of our people, American Indian and Alaska Native. I am also a PhD student at the Information School at the UW, where I study tribal data sovereignty. My question is, yes, we acknowledge it. We acknowledge the statistical insignificance of my people. That's fine. Let's say it that way. Let's just own that. What is the project doing to amend the situation? Because all of this area is Indian country. And also considering that at the School of Social Work, we have the Erie Indigenous Wellness Research Institute, who might be able to support that. This question is not so much about, the outcomes of this, but what the fact is that it'd be nice to be able to see, because in the city of Seattle, we make up 3% of the population. In the state of Washington, it's between 1 and 5, depending on who you count. We know that ACS is wrong. And as a researcher, I understand that that is not the way to capture information on tribes, especially those that are on federal recognition statuses. Especially now, considering that there are 2 federally recognized tribes in King County, to not see any statistics on the American Indian or Alaska Native population who were displaced, dispossessed from Alaska to here, that really has me thinking. And so I'm wondering, what's the solution? How can me, my children, my household, how can we be counted? We are just so systemically erased that I wonder, what are we going to do? I'm also the tribal relations liaison in the Governor's Office of Equity and the former tribal liaison for the UW. So I have a lot of questions when it comes to just statistical insignificance of our people. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And you're right. And we are not doing enough. And I think we have utilized data sets that have been available and have so many wrong assumptions that have been baked into them. And those just have been what has been available for us to utilize on like a year-to-year consistent basis. What we need to do to start is to actually look at the specific costs on reservations that might actually be different than the costs that we are baking into our assumptions about certain counties. That's one way that I think we should start acknowledging and seeing and recognizing the differences in the costs that might occur in one location versus another, particularly on reservations versus on, and then the other component will be to start utilizing data, like you said, to recognize and collect household income. I might have to talk to you after, because I don't know what data is out there to start collecting that, to do that comparison. So, I think that the School of Social Work, that organization, I'm not sure to collect that specific data point, but one other place that we have done disaggregation is in the American Community Survey, which is it doesn't capture all of the different needs, but it does look at specific tribes. I think there's maybe a list of 40. So, and we could start by representing that in our reports, right? Showing that, but I would still like to ensure that the cost needs are being accurately reflected based on the geographic location too. So we have a lot of work to do on that. I appreciate you bringing that up, and I'm sorry that I don't have a better answer at this time. It is woefully inaccurate when it comes to that.
Alrighty. Well, thank you so much, Kucklick Chair, for that question, and Annie as well for answering that. Again, Annie's email is in the chat, so if you would like to follow up with her, go ahead and send her an email. And now I'm going to attempt to share my screen as we transition into community compensation. So bear with me as I am only on 2 screens today instead of 3. So here we go. Can everybody see the presentation? Okay, perfect. Wonderful. All right. So good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to be here with you all and sit alongside Annie and Shannon to share our work today. So my name is Sabrina Njoroge. My pronouns are she, her, and they. I am a shared power consultant with the Office of Equity, and I'm also the current project lead for community compensation. I am a tall, golden brown Black person who is female presenting with multicolored brown braids with blonde highlights that are curled at the bottom. I am wearing Black rimmed glasses, hoop earrings, a nose ring on the right side, and a lace Black blouse and a silver lotus necklace. That was a mouthful. Thank you so much for bearing with us today. So we are going to kind of go over a few things in the guidelines. Maybe, there we go. Going into kind of, how compensation started, how we as an office are staying committed to ensuring that community members are not only at the table where decisions are made, but are equitably receiving compensation. I'll then go and discuss, how all of our work is connected, like Annie mentioned earlier. That will lead us into talking about where we are currently with the guidelines and the revisions being made. And last but not least, I will share a few resources with you all. Does that sound like an okay agenda for today? Thumbs up. Maybe we should do a temperature check. If you want to drop an emoji of how you're doing so far, just to know that I still know that you're out there and hanging in there with me. I see all thumbs. Perfect. Okay, wonderful. Let's get into it. So, what is community compensation? So, as you may or may not know, the Senate Bill 5793 was established in June of 2022. The legislature states that the Office of Equity had to develop uniform equity-driven guidelines for agencies on the issuance of stipends and allowances under the RCW 43.03.220 by December 1st of 2022. So it goes on to say that the legislature finds that equitable public policy discussions should include individuals directly impacted by that policy. In order to do so, the legislature supports removing barriers to that participation. The legislature finds that asking community members with lower financial means to volunteer their time and expertise while state employees and representatives of advocacy organizations receive compensation from their respective agency or organization for their time and experience ultimately hinders full and open public participation. As a result, the legislature finds that removing financial barriers for those individuals will foster and increase access to government and enriches public policy discussion and decisions. So what in the heck does that even mean? Simply put, it means that the government realizes that we need to start prioritizing those voices that are directly impacted by the services that we provide, and we need to compensate folks for their willingness to not only share their time and lived experience, but to build trust with government. So as far as the guidelines go, those were originally put together within, I think it was about 6 months. This consisted of meetings with stakeholders across the state, as well as an advisory work group consisting of community members and staff. The intent behind creating the guidelines was to remove barriers to participation in government actions, discussions, and decision-making, and to recognize the value and expertise community members contribute to state government work groups. So overall, community compensation really aims to increase community engagement and build meaningful relationships. So fast forward to March of 2022, our now director, Megan Matthews, recorded a live Q&A that went over best practices for community compensation. You can find those videos or find that video on the Office of Equity's YouTube channel. So our entire office, as I mentioned before, is dedicated and committed to prioritizing community first and making sure that underrepresented and underserved communities' voices are heard. So that was a mouthful and it was a quick recap. So I want to make sure that we're doing okay before I move on to the next slide. How are we feeling about this? I can't see the chat, so visual thumbs up from those of you that are on camera. If y'all are doing okay, or if there's a concern in the chat, please let me know. All right. So how our work is connected. So you might be saying, okay, Sabrina, that's great and all, but how does all of this connect? Well, I'm so glad that you asked. So as I mentioned before, Senate Bill 5793 refers to the RCW 43.03.220, which basically lays out, the definition of Class 1 volunteers and the qualifications. However, it also mentions Senate Bill 1541, which is the Nothing About Us Without Us Act. So, really quick overview of the Nothing About Us Without Us is it states that government recognizes that underrepresented populations are often left out of the policy decisions that affect them the most. So people with direct lived experience with a particular issue are experts in their own lives and experience and are best equipped to find solutions to those issues. The legislature finds that when underrepresented populations are included in policy decision-making around issues that directly affect them, the solutions put forward make a great positive impact on those it seeks to help. So it goes on to talk about the importance of including folks in the decision-making process, right? So that sounds a little bit familiar. The way that I like to think about it is 1541, Nothing About Us Without Us, is laying the foundation of the importance of engaging, co-creating, prioritizing, and including community members from marginalized communities. 5793, also known as community compensation, is the law that mandates agencies to compensate volunteers on its boards, committees, councils, work groups, and commissions. Now, going back and connecting it to the self-sufficiency standard. So the standard supports our work specifically for the guidelines in helping us create an equitable compensation, eligibility, and reimbursement rate for the folks that sit on those work groups. We have to revise our guidelines in accordance with the new self-sufficiency standard that I believe drops about every 3 years. Is that correct, Annie? Okay,
That's
perfect.
correct. Yep.
So we have to update it in accordance with the new standard every 3 years to make sure that we are keeping up with the cost of living and federal poverty guideline levels. So ECSA, which is the next presentation that Shannon will go on to explain, is really the cherry on top. As you'll see, this program increases access to existing services to support low-income Washingtonians. So all of our bodies of work aim to reduce barriers and poverty, as well as ensure that all Washingtonians have full access to the opportunities, power, and resources they need to flourish and achieve their full potential. Oh, I'm sorry. So I didn't say the acronym. So EXA is the Economic Security for All. I apologize. All right, so let's get into this revisions project. This is what I'm most excited about. So as I mentioned before, the office is mandated to compile and analyze the information received from agencies. We're also mandated to prepare a report to the governor's office by this December of 2024. And then we also have to provide, ways of improving the process and recommendations to further decrease barriers to participation. So we did just that. We met with stakeholders, which included state agencies and impacted community members. We also kicked off our project in March in doing this and took a deep dive into analyzing all of our data. In addition to that, in May, we started meeting with all the stakeholders, like I just said. This year, in addition to meeting with impacted community members and staff and state agencies, we also included our own internal community advisory board, as they have firsthand experience being compensated by the Office of Equity. So when I tell you all of the folks that we met with did not hold back on their feedback, I am not kidding. My contractor and I were blown away in a good way with all of the feedback, experiences, and most importantly, the vulnerability that was shared, the experience, the storytelling. I honestly cannot wait to share all of our findings with all of you as soon as we update the guidelines that will drop July of this year. So be on the lookout for that. And then, as I mentioned before, by October, we're hoping to put together that report and then eventually send it off by December 1st to the governor with all of our data and recommendations. So that's kind of the timeline of the revisions part of it. Right now, the contractor is taking back all of the feedback, all of the information, and really trying to squish it all together and put it in an updated version. And so with those updates, you'll see an increase in the compensation rate. Right now, it is $45 an hour. It's going to be moving up to, I believe we decided on 57. And by we, I mean the advisory work group. So it's not the Office of Equity that is deciding this, and Megan really pushes on that it's not us making it. It is the communities that we serve that are telling us what we need to do. So just clarifying that. You'll see that. You'll see more best practices and ways to compensate folks, whether it's from an internal perspective of how can you develop these processes and procedures internally within your agencies, and then also a barrier-free way for community members to not only engage with us, but to interact. So my biggest piece on this project, the one thing that I'm really pushing forward, is connecting with more folks across the state. Again, that's both in communities to get the word out there, because some of the feedback we've heard is like, hey, I'd love to participate, but unless I know someone who is connected, I wouldn't have known about this otherwise. So that's one of my goals, is to make sure that that is no longer a thing, as well as get the word out about the funding that is out there, the $250,000 funding that we have per legislation for state agencies to use. So I'm getting connected with the smaller agencies, different agencies that are utilizing the compensation guidelines, and really making sure that the word is pushed out on that. So very quickly, so that we make time for Shannon to go into her presentation, I just wanted to kind of, go back over some of the resources that I mentioned. So we talked today about the Senate Bill 5793, which is the basis of where our guidelines came from. I also mentioned the Nothing About Us Without Us Act, which is Senate Bill 1541. Later on, after my presentation concludes, I will be dropping links to all of these, and the space where you can find on the Office of Equity's website where the community compensation guidelines will be. And then last but not least, the self-sufficiency standard. And I think I dropped that earlier in the chat, but we can always redrop it again for those of you looking for that data. So I recognize that this is a lot of information, especially with 3 different presentations today. So I know that I won't be able to answer everyone's questions, but please reach out to me via Teams or email, whichever is more comfortable for you. And I would be happy to meet with you and just see how I can better support. So thank you so much for your time today. I will stop sharing my screen and I will hand it over to you, Shannon.
Thanks, Sabrina. Hi, everyone. Should I share my own screen? That seems to be what we're doing, right? I'll go ahead with that. Okay. Let's see. So I think I can do this. Okay. Are you seeing my presentation? What are you seeing?
Yes.
You're seeing the EXA presentation?
Yes.
Not my notes or my emails.
Yeah,
Okay,
we can see the
perfect.
presentation.
Great. So let me just get this set up. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Shannon Brundle, and I am an EXA program manager for the Employment Security Department. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a white woman with shoulder-length dark hair, and I'm wearing glasses and a black shirt. It's an honor to be here today and get to share an overview of the Economic Security for All program, which is a poverty reduction program, and to get to present with Annie and Sabrina. We've been partnering with Annie and the UW Self-Sufficiency team, and we'll be working closely with Sabrina going forward as we begin utilizing the Office of Equity's compensation guidelines to fairly compensate living experts who've been sharing their experiences to improve the EXA program. So today I'm going to talk about the EXA model and how that aligns with ESD's core values and the Office of Equity's PAIR plan. I will briefly cover House Bill 2230 and EXA's path to becoming a state law. I'll also touch on the Department of Commerce's Community Reinvestment Fund programs and how those programs are braided into EXA to provide additional resources for EXA participants. I'll also reference the UW Self-Sufficiency Calculator throughout the presentation, as it is a key tool for EXA career coaches and participants. So let's get started with the EXA model. So critical to EXA's development are some very important principles. EXA is guided by the voices of lived experience. It is an important principle of EXA that those experiencing poverty are engaged in the decision-making, the decisions being made, and it is those experiencing poverty whose voices are heard and considered in the design of the program. EXA aligns with the core values of the Employment Security Department and the Workforce Development System, which starts by leading with love and compassion and care for one another. We push for equity, which requires developing, strengthening, and supporting policies and processes that distribute and prioritize resources to people in identified groups who have been historically and currently marginalized. It requires breaking down systemic barriers and giving everyone full and true access to opportunities. And this goes along with belonging, where no one is left out and where people feel their voice is heard and considered in the design of political, social, and cultural structures. As good stewards, we are accountable for our responsibilities and commitments. Good stewardship is acting to ensure our communities can trust us to support their needs and that we truly center our work around the people we serve. EXA also follows the Office of Equity's PAIR framework and is a pro-equity, anti-racism, and anti-poverty model focused around the mission that everyone in Washington has full access to the opportunities, power, and resources that they need to flourish and achieve their full potential. All right, so Economic Security for All, EXA, is a model for helping people move out of poverty into careers that pay full self-sufficiency wages. as determined by the UW Self-Sufficiency Calculator, with the focus on BIPOC and historically marginalized communities and the unhoused and rural communities. It was designed in partnership with people experiencing poverty and Washington's local workforce development boards. The purpose of this model is to empower and incentivize communities to coordinate existing poverty reduction resources and benefits to make them easier to access, and to get them to the people who really need them, and work as a coordinated system to help more people move out of poverty with equity in the state of Washington. EXA came into being as a response to the feedback received through the state's poverty reduction work group and the observations being made in 2018 regarding the high levels of poverty in the state and the difficulty and burden being put onto families trying to access services. The fragmented systems created additional unnecessary barriers. And EXA is one of the programs working to change that by bringing many agencies and community partners together to streamline referral processes and access to resources. At the core, the EXA model contains 4 unique design elements that are used in combination. First, career coaches work with participants to develop a career plan focused on achieving and maintaining self-sufficiency based on UW's Self-Sufficiency Calculator. So this is really where the participants are being enrolled into the program, and the calculator is used to look at income adequacy levels and then what the ultimate goal towards self-sufficiency. And based on the presentation that Annie gave, where we've learned a lot about what that actually really means, and how that's not there's further you can go beyond self-sufficiency. Next, career coaches and participants work together to determine the best combination of workforce services, education, and social services, utilizing the bundled services desk aid as the participant moves along their path to self-sufficiency. EXA focuses on equity, and therefore local workforce boards conduct proactive outreach, recruiting to BIPOC, rural, and unhoused folks to increase access and partnership with communities often kept furthest from opportunities. And lastly, the program empowers local solutions and broad local flexibility. As we know as a state agency that the knowledge of how to best serve vulnerable populations lies within the local organizations already activated in those spaces. Okay, oddly, my mouse just died, so I'm doing a little bit more with the mouse pad than I normally do. So continuing on, EXA has had many program enhancements since it was launched as a pilot in 2019, and I will focus on a few of those now. First one, EXA participants are automatically income eligible to receive the full Washington College grant with no FAFSA or WASFA required. This partnership with WASAC is enabling EXA participants to more easily access resources for college. Monthly incentives are another program enhancement. EXA participants are eligible for monthly incentive payments for each month they are pursuing their career plans. And the Commerce Community Reinvestment Fund partnership is supporting LWDB's building more business services and partnerships, and particularly with recognized by and for organizations. Side note here, the Community Reinvestment Fund is a grant that is intended to increase opportunity for communities that have historically been most impacted by the war on drugs. So those funds run through EXA, but they have a very specific intent. Okay, I want to just quickly share some program outcomes with you. 52% of the participants in EXA are BIPOC compared to 22% of Washingtonians. EXA exceeded all statewide targets for enrollment, training, and self-sufficiency goals. This last year, EXA has helped over 700 people reach self-sufficiency with a median annualized income of $42,390. And many of the participants that we work with have been long-term unemployed for various personal reasons and started the program earning less than $9,860 annually. And EXA has been highlighted as a best practice by the U.S. Department of Labor. Okay, House Bill 2230. EXA became codified into law in the last legislative session, which was really exciting, with nearly unanimous support. This was a big effort, and it involved many partners throughout the state, including the Office of Equity. The path to law improved EXA overall by bringing more partners to the table and incorporating the lessons learned from those conversations into the program as we set up for the next program year. We will be utilizing the Office of Equity's compensation guidelines to fairly compensate living experts who inform the program going forward. Next slide. EXA Career Accelerator incentives. I want to just touch quickly on the Career Accelerator incentives that come from the community reinvestment funds and partnerships with Department of Commerce. EXA participants receive $1,000 per month incentives. The focus is on prioritizing benefits to Black, Latino, and Indigenous individuals. The monthly incentive is designed to support EXA participants to stay on a career pathway leading to a living wage job. And these incentives, they've been going out since, I think the first one started going out in December. And so we have been getting a lot of feedback on the impact that they're having on people's lives and how much stress is lifted off of the participants because of having this additional monthly income while they're working towards their career goals. And as Annie said earlier, the tool with the self-sufficiency calculator down the road, we'll be able to hopefully have that benefits cliff tool like increased or added as well, so that these conversations with participants around exactly how $1,000 additional monthly income will affect all of your benefits in the holistic self-sufficiency picture in their lives. Those conversations will be better supported by the program managers that they're working with, the career specialists. Now the EXA business support and subsidized training. This is another part of the community reinvestment funds. The business support and subsidized training provides business navigator services to help businesses succeed by offering work-based training, including on-the-job training, work experience, incumbent worker training, and customized training. And then the third aspect of the community reinvestment fund is the individual development accounts. And this is really exciting, these individual development accounts. We're working with WWA as well to be able to extend these, offer these to EXA participants. The IDAs support individuals on their journey to acquire assets, such as housing, education, or starting and growing a business by providing match savings accounts and supporting participants develop financial skills and knowledge to help them achieve their unique saving goals. So this is, we have not, at this point, there has not been an IDA developed yet, but in the next month, we're going to be seeing these taken off. And so I'm really excited about that. And we'll have some data on how that is looking over the next year. And then this is my last slide. And this is just a visual so you can see where all of the local workforce development boards are in the state. And so you have reference for accessing the Economic Security for All program in your area. And then my contact information is listed there. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And I just thank you all so much for giving me the time to share a little bit about, to do that really quick overview of EXA today.
Thank you so
Wonderful.
much, Shannon.
Yeah. Go ahead, Dina.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I thought you had jumped off, Sabrina. We're going to open it for questions for Shannon. I don't see any in the chat or in the Q&A. So if you'd like to come on and ask your question, feel free.
You can always email me after too if something comes up, if you need if you have any questions at all. So thank you.
Hi, this is Kate Fernald. I have a question. I was wondering if we know of young folks who would be eligible for the services and funding that EXA is providing, what would be the best person to contact? Should I just Google, the workforce place in my area?
Yeah, where are you at?
I'm in Vancouver, Washington.
Yeah, in Southwest, that's the Southwest Washington Workforce Council. They provide their EXA services through the WorkSource that's located there, and they also do a lot of outreach into the more rural areas. So yes, you can work through the WorkSource, or if you want to reach out to me, I can also do a warm handoff as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you all for the work that you're doing to better our communities. It's just wonderful to hear about. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
It looks like there's a question in the chat about whether these presentations will be available afterwards. And I shared mine earlier. And so if you all want to share that out, whatever is easier, but happy to do that.
Dana, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I said yes. Our communications team is going to help us link them and make sure everyone can access. All right, if there aren't any other questions, I think we're wrapping up. Sabrina, if you want to do the closing.
I think there might be one, someone has their hand raised. Might be one.
Yeah, Jeremy, you want to go ahead?
So I'm just naturally curious, so I always have like 5 questions. But I'm really curious, Shannon, to better understand, like how do you manage the customer relationships in a system? I know that Workforce has databases and systems, and one of the common frustrations that I have as a state employee is I hear from a lot of people who are trying to get services. This is also true for nonprofits, where they're consistently giving the same information over and over and over to different agencies and to different programs. And I would love to see not a like universal standard system, but maybe systems that talk to one another. So that way, if you're receiving information and we have resources over here at Commerce, we can come together and assist that person. So my question is, if you're able to share your knowledge of how you do that, because I'm trying to make that case here at Commerce that we need something like that, so that our programs, because we have 300 programs not really talking to one another other than the human beings, right? And that's difficult to manage. So can you talk about a little bit about the systems that you use and that give notification to other programs to come in and to assist?
Yeah, that is such a great question, because that is just a critical thing. Like most of our partners have been talking about this for a long time around like why are participants retelling the same stories and information over and over, and have been trying to figure out ways to get around that. And there has been some talk about a universal intake form, and that is not something that I've worked directly on, and I don't know exactly where that is in the process. But depending on, so for EXA specifically, depending on where, what areas program we're talking about, in Spokane, for instance, they had all of their providers all on site in one resource center so that customers could just be there and utilize all of the services that were in that space. And so when they made referrals, it was right there, convenient, easy. And then other areas, their referral systems look different. But for us specifically, we use all of our data is put into a database that we use at ESD. And we share, I mean, there's not really a shared database that we use with DSHS or any of the other agencies at this point, but I personally would also love to see some movement made towards that. And I'll look for opportunities to push on that. So thank you.
I just quickly wanted to make a comment. Jeremy, like, you're speaking my language. This is amazing. This is exactly what I'm biased when I say this, as shared power consultants push day in, day out, get folks communicating, get them to build that relationship between those agencies, not just with community, but within these agencies, because you're right, there are so many different programs that we offer as a state that we're creating barriers by literally just making them go through hoops of different, okay, you have to go to DSHS to get this. And then once you're done there, then you got to go to Commerce and send in an application. And once you're done, then you got to go to, ESD. Like, there's so many hoops and barriers. And I've been hearing firsthand in these stakeholder meetings, just that, like by the fifth hoop that I have to go through, I don't want to do it anymore, right? I don't want to ask for help. So then now we're creating harm, and we have people that need the help that are not getting the help. And then that affects our funding, right? So I just appreciate you calling that in, because it's so important. And as I mentioned earlier, for compensation, that is part of my goal, is really to connect folks. Like, I don't think I asked this earlier, but if anybody has examples of compensation processes or anything related to any of the topics we discussed today, please send them our way, because we want to be able, as the Office of Equity, to put that on our website as an example to show others, like, hey, if you're just starting out, this is how we modeled ours, or this is how we connected folks. Like, that is really what we're here to do. So again, in closing, thank you all so very much for being patient with us, for listening to us and all of our updates. I encourage you to reach out to either Annie, Shannon, or myself if you have any questions about what we talked about today. And other than that, I hope everyone has a wonderful lunch and a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you.